March 20, 1934. George Zeigler, known to his landlady as a handsome and brilliant businessman, stands in front of the Minerva Cafe in the Chicago suburb of Cicero, a town long controlled by the Capone syndicate. It is a few minutes before midnight when a sedan pulls up to the curb and a couple of shotguns go off. Zeigler drops to the sidewalk mortally wounded. The barrels were close by when the triggers were pulled, as his face has been turned to pulp and he is no longer recognizable. He dies a short time later at the hospital. Fingerprints showed that George Zeigler was actually Fred Goetz, a former killer for Al Capone who had more recently turned to armed robbery and kidnapping with the infamous Barker Karpis gang of public enemies. Chicago authorities had been searching for him for over 8 years. An underworld enigma, Goetz, who was born Valentine's Day 1897, for all due purposes should not have been a gangster. Unlike most hoodlums of his era, he didn't grow up poor in a crime-ridden inner-city neighborhood. He came from a well-to-do family, enlisted during World War I and served in the Army, in their new aviation branch. After an honorable discharge, he enrolled at the University of Illinois, where he was a successful student and athlete. He graduated in 1923. In an odd case of gangster happenstance, future public enemy handsome Jack Clotas also attended the university at the same time. Years later, some wondered if the two future hoodlums knew each other while on campus or worked together during their later gangster careers. Straddling both sides of the underworld, the organized crime side while with Capone in the 20s and the public enemy side while operating with the infamous Barker Karpis gang in the early 30s, Goetz took part in some of the most notorious crimes of both eras. While with Capone, he participated in two of Gangland's most famous murders: the killing of Brooklyn crime boss Frankie Uale and, the most heinous of all, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. While with the Barker Karpis gang, he would engineer two of the highest-profile kidnappings of the era, that of St. Paul brewer William Ham Jr. as well as banker Edward Bremer from the same city. Summer of 1924 found the college graduate working as captain of the lifeguards at Chicago's Clarendon Beach on the shore of Lake Michigan. A freak storm on the evening of August 8 caused a mini tsunami when 6 feet of water was pulled out to the lake. Amazed at the anomaly, numerous bathers ventured out beyond the safety ropes where the water had vanished. Within 10 minutes, however, the water returned at a rapid rate before many had a chance to get to shore. Goetz and his team were credited with saving over a dozen women and children. It would be the last positive thing said about him in the press. The following summer, Goetz went from hero to monster when he was accused of attempting to rape a 7-year-old girl. The lifeguard allegedly lured the girl into a basement or alley and tried to force himself on her. She put up a fight and her screams attracted a woman who summoned a cop. Goetz was arrested at the scene, and as he was being escorted to jail, he made a break for it. The officer opened fire and Goetz surrendered. This episode set Goetz on his criminal path. His parents put up $5,000 for his bail, and he was released with his trial pending the end of October. In need of money to hire the best legal representation, Goetz turned to robbery. On the evening of October 3rd, he and two accomplices, Roger Bessemer and a guy known only as Jaime, chose Dr. Henry Gross and his wife for their victims. Stationing themselves in front of the doctor's house, the trio waited for the couple to pull up in their car. When the chauffeur-driven sedan arrived, the bandits attacked. Dr. Gross pulled a gun and opened fire, wounding Bessemer. Goetz and his Confederates returned fire, hitting the doctor and killing his chauffeur Barney Hernandez. Goetz and Jaime made a getaway, but the wounded Bessemer was captured. The injured bandit squealed and told police about Goetz and that he could be found at the Hotel Shenandoah on Chicago's north side. 50 officers were on hand for the raid. With all exits covered, police rushed into the hotel and checked every room. Despite guards at all exits, Goetz managed to escape, although they did nab his girlfriend. 2 weeks later, on Saturday, October 17th, a couple were driving with a friend when their car was forced to the side of the road. 3 bandits robbed them of $12,000 in cash and jewelry. When looking through mugshots, the only photo they picked with certainty was Goetz's. Wanted for 2 robberies and a murder, Goetz failed to show up for his rape trial at the end of the month. What transpired in Goetz's life over the next few years is unknown, but by early 1928, the bumbling bandit and failed lifeguard was now known as George Zeigler, a gunman working for Al Capone. A lot of what is known about Goetz comes to us from the memoir of Georgette Winkler, the wife of gangster Gus Winkler. Originally from St. Louis, Gus Winkler was a kidnapper and bank robber who also became a gunman for Al Capone and rose to prominence as a North Side racketeer. Since they weren't of Italian ancestry, Winkler and Goetz, along with a few others, were known as Al Capone's American Boys. Though it's possible that Goetz may have known Winkler earlier, Georgette has them meeting in early 1928 when her husband went to work for Capone. Although on Scarface's payroll, the American Boys still dabbled in armed robbery. They brought much heat down upon themselves when on April 16, 1928, Goetz, Winkler and 2 other American boys, Ray Nugent and Bob Carey, robbed a Federal Express truck in Toledo, Ohio. Though well planned and expertly executed, the job was an utter failure. After successfully stealing the strong boxes containing thousands, one of them forgot to bring the explosives to blow open the containers, so the boxes were loaded back into the car and driven into Toledo. On the way to their garage, Goetz's erratic driving attracted the attention of a police car that followed the gang. The officers surprised the bandits while they were unloading the strong boxes, and a firefight broke out, resulting in Goetz killing Officer George Zintara with a blast from a machine gun. Not only did the bandits have to flee the city without their loot, in their haste, Goetz left behind his coat that contained a number of their addresses in a pocket. The American Boys moved from their apartments before the Toledo police had a chance to track them down. Capone, however, learned that his men were responsible for the botched robbery and murder of a police officer and wasn't happy about it. Goetz and Winkler were called in. Goetz believed that they were going to be killed and didn't want to go, but Winkler talked him into it. Capone let them know that he wouldn't tolerate anything that could bring heat onto his operations. Both men apologized to the gang leader and were forgiven. A few months later, Goetz and Winkler were summoned by Capone. He had a contract for them. Along with Capone's lieutenant, Louis Little New York Campagna, they were sent to Brooklyn to bump off Capone's one-time boss and partner Frankie Uale. Goetz, Winkler and Campagna headed to Brooklyn and began tracing Uale's movements. On the afternoon of July 1, 1928, Uale was drinking in a speakeasy when he received a phone call urging him to leave on some pretense. As the gang leader drove off in his coupe, a sedan containing 4 men, some reports say 5, came up alongside him and nearly blew his head off with shotgun and machine gun fire. Though Georgette Winkler stated that her husband Gus, Goetz and Campagna were the killers, reports also have fellow American boy Fred Burke in the car. Later that year, Goetz and the other American boys received another contract from Capone. He wanted them to give his North Side nemesis George "Bugs" Moran the Frankie Uale treatment. That winter the men began meeting at Goetz's bungalow to work out a plan. In early 1929 a plan had been formulated. They would bump off Moran in his gang's own garage. Posing as policemen, Goetz and Burke would enter the garage and line up whoever was inside, and then Moran would be shot down along with anybody else who started any trouble. A room was rented across the street from the SMC Cartage Company, the North Side Gang's garage that housed all their bootlegging trucks. Lookouts were placed inside, including a new American boy Goetz brought in named Byron Bolton. Goetz, Burke, Winkler, Bob Carey and Ray Nugent were housed in a nearby apartment awaiting the phone call that Moran was in the garage. Once everyone was set, it became a waiting game. As fate would have it, at 10:30 on the morning of February 14th, St. Valentine's Day as well as Goetz's 32nd birthday, the lookouts placed the call to the shooters. Moran was in the garage. The killers arrived in 2 cars. First, Goetz and Burke entered dressed as the officers and found 7 men inside. They ordered everyone against the wall. 2 more men were let in who produced Thompson machine guns from under their coats. Not knowing which man was more in and not knowing what to do, the decision was made to kill all of them. The machine gunners raked the North Siders, and once they were down, 2 of them were made near unrecognizable with shotgun blasts to the head. The job done, the machine gunners tucked the Thompsons back into their coats and exited the garage with their hands up, followed by the fake cops. Any witnesses would think that an arrest had been made. Like the American Express job from the previous spring, what became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre was a good plan but poorly executed. Namely because Bugs Moran wasn't there. Capone wanted to kill Byron Bolton for making such a blunder, but Goetz went to bat for him and he was spared. Though Bugs got away, Capone basically got the result he wanted. The North Side gangster was no longer a serious threat to him. The slaughter of 7 gangsters, however, unleashed a tempest over Chicago gangland and the national underworld in general. Capone was summoned to the East Coast to explain himself to the other leading gangsters. During the crime summit in Atlantic City, the National Syndicate decided that it would be good for Capone to go away for a while. An arrest was planned in Philadelphia, and Uale went to prison for 10 months on a gun charge. Likewise, with all the heat in Chicago, the American boys took a powder also. Goetz gravitated to St. Paul, Minnesota, and became acquainted with the city's crime czar Harry Sawyer, who later introduced him to the soon-to-be infamous public enemies, the Barker Karpis gang. With both the blessing and aid of Harry Sawyer, Goetz and the Barker gang united to kidnap local St. Paul brewery owner William Ham Jr. On June 15, 1933, Ham was snatched off the street while walking to his home for lunch. After 4 days, he was released after a $100,000 ransom was paid. It all went down rather smoothly. 6 months later, the gangsters decided to kidnap St. Paul Bank president Edward Bremer. Goetz vetoed the job, arguing that the city was too hot from the Ham kidnapping, but was overruled. On the morning of January 17, 1934, Bremer was forced into a car. Things didn't go as smoothly as the Ham job, and it took nearly 3 weeks to collect the $200,000 ransom. This time, the culprits got sloppy, and the FBI knew the Barker Karpis gang was behind it within days. The Bremer kidnapping would be the beginning of the end for the Barker Karpis mob and Goetz's final job. He and his girlfriend returned to an apartment that they kept in Chicago, where the landlady knew them as Mr. and Mrs. Seibert. That March, Bremer ransom money started popping up in the Windy City. Just before midnight on March 20th, Goetz was standing outside the Minerva Cafe in Cicero when a sedan pulled up to the curb and some shotguns went off. Goetz took blasts to the face and chest and dropped to the sidewalk, mortally wounded. Another shot went through a window of the tavern next door. Goetz was taken to the hospital and died shortly thereafter. A search of his body turned up numerous pieces of identification under his alias of George Zeigler. As news of the murder went to press, Chicago was hit with a mystery. Who was George Zeigler, and why would somebody want to blow his face off? The mystery of who George Zeigler was solved when the results of his fingerprints came back, but that left a why. Some in the underworld thought he was killed on orders from Frank Nitti, who had been removing other men from the Capone era like Ted Newberry and Goetz's old pal Gus Winkler. Nitti may not have liked the idea of having a public enemy so close to home bringing on heat from the Bremer kidnapping. However, a few years later, during hearings regarding the kidnapping, Goetz's buddy Byron Bolton told the court that Goetz was bumped off by Doc Barker and probably Alvin Karpis over the proceeds from the Bremer kidnapping. Apparently, the gang trusted Goetz to have the ransom money laundered in Reno, but the underworld there refused to exchange it, and Goetz had kept it for himself. This is backed up by Louis Little New York Campagna, who told Gus Winkler's widow that Goetz had been killed by the St. Paul crowd. To read more about Fred Goetz and the other American boys, check out Al Capone and His American Boys. Memoirs of a Mobster's Wife by William Helmer. For more information on the St. Paul underworld of the 20s and 30s, pick up John Dillinger's Slept Here. A Crook's Tour of Crime and Corruption in St. Paul 1920 to 1936.